Good evening and welcome back to Bleak Fears. Tonight we journey into the forgotten depths of the Pacific Northwest, where ancient forests cradle secrets darker than their shadows, and where 9 real people discovered that the greatest horrors do not announce themselves with fanfare, but instead whisper through the trees, hide behind the fog, and wait in places no one dares to enter. These are not legends passed down through generations. These are documented accounts of ordinary individuals who stumbled into nightmare scenarios they never saw coming, events that law enforcement still discusses in hushed tones, and mysteries that continue to haunt the communities where they occurred. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Bleak Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us step into the shadows of the Pacific Northwest, where civilization ends and terror begins. Conrad had been working as a seismologist for nearly 15 years when he took the overnight shift at the remote monitoring station in Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. It was October 1997, and the facility sat alone on a ridge overlooking what remained of Mount St. Helens blast zone, a skeletal reminder of nature's raw power. The station existed primarily to monitor volcanic activity, tracking even the slightest tremors that might signal another awakening beneath the mountain. Conrad didn't mind the solitude. In fact, he preferred it. The hum of the kinemetric seismograph arrays and the soft clicking of data recorders provided a rhythm that made the long nights pass more easily. He arrived just before sunset, the autumn air already biting cold at this elevation. The previous shift operator, a younger technician named Josiah, seemed unusually eager to leave. Conrad noticed it, but didn't think much of it at the time. People got strange about working alone in places like this, especially as the days grew shorter and the forest pressed in darker around the small building. Josiah mentioned something about irregular baseline readings, but attributed them to equipment calibration issues. Conrad nodded, made his notes, and watched the taillights disappear down the winding access road. The first few hours passed without incident. Conrad ran through his standard protocols, checking each instrument, recording ambient readings, and monitoring the network of sensors spread throughout the surrounding wilderness. Everything appeared normal. The seismographs traced their steady lines, occasionally jumping with the minor tremors that were completely routine in this geologically active region. He made coffee in the small kitchenette, settled into his chair, and prepared for the long stretch until dawn. At exactly 2:47 in the morning, every instrument in the station registered the same anomaly simultaneously. Conrad sat up straight, his coffee forgotten as he stared at the displays. Rhythmic pulses appeared across all frequencies, not matching any geological signature he'd encountered in his career. The pattern was too regular, too precise. Each pulse arrived at intervals of exactly 7.3 seconds, and the signal originated from multiple points arranged in what appeared to be a geometric pattern surrounding the station. Conrad's scientific mind raced through possibilities: mechanical interference, atmospheric conditions, instrument malfunction, but nothing fit. The signals were too coordinated, too deliberate. He checked and rechecked his equipment, running diagnostics that all came back clean. The pulses continued, unwavering in their precision. Conrad grabbed his handheld radio and stepped outside, thinking perhaps he could isolate an external source. The moment he opened the door, he felt it. A vibration that wasn't quite sound, wasn't quite movement, but something that resonated in his chest cavity like standing too close to massive speakers. The October night should have been alive with the usual forest sounds: wind through the remaining standing dead trees, the occasional call of a night bird, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. Instead, absolute silence pressed against his ears. The copper taste flooded his mouth suddenly, metallic and wrong. Conrad looked up at the trees surrounding the station, and felt his rational mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The trees were moving, not swaying randomly in wind. There was no wind, but moving in perfect synchronization. Every trunk, every branch, bending and straightening in rhythm with those impossible 7.3-second intervals. The darkness between the trees looked different somehow, thicker than ordinary shadow, almost textured. Conrad had studied physics, understood the behavior of light and matter, yet what he observed defied those principles entirely. He retreated inside, his hands shaking as he closed the door. The vibration in his chest didn't stop. If anything, it intensified. Conrad returned to his instruments, determined to document whatever was happening with scientific precision. That's when he noticed the papers on his desk. Handwritten notes covered 3 full pages in his own distinctive scrawl, filled with complex mathematical formulas and coordinate calculations. He stared at them, a cold dread spreading through his body. He had no memory of writing these notes. The calculations referenced harmonic frequencies and included a notation at the bottom that read, "Response window closing November 4th, 1997. Conrad checked his shift log, the standard record where he documented all activities and observations. According to his entries, he'd been recording data and making calculations for the past 11 hours. He looked at his wristwatch. Only 3 hours had passed since Josiah left. The discrepancy made no sense. He noticed other details then, small things that felt profoundly wrong. The backup generator was running, its steady thrum audible beneath the strange pulses still registering on every instrument. But the main power had never failed. The indicator lights showed full connection to the grid. Why would the backup be active? His coffee mug sat on the desk where he'd left it. Conrad reached for it automatically, then froze. The mug was empty and cold, as if it had been sitting untouched for hours. He'd just poured it. He was certain he'd just poured it. The memory was fresh and clear, the smell of the coffee, the warmth of the mug in his hands. Yet the evidence contradicted his certainty. The data tapes would provide answers. Conrad pulled the recordings from the past 3 hours, his training taking over even as his mind reeled. He loaded the tape into the playback system and listened through headphones, expecting to hear the ambient sounds of the station, his own movements, perhaps some clue to the missing time. Instead, static filled his ears for long stretches. Then, cutting through the white noise, he heard his own voice. But he wasn't speaking in any conversation he remembered. His recorded voice recited mathematical formulas, advanced theoretical physics equations he'd studied in graduate school, but hadn't worked with in years. The formulas dealt with resonance patterns and harmonic frequencies. As his recorded voice continued its strange monologue, other sounds emerged beneath it. Multiple voices speaking in perfect unison. The words unclear, but the tone unmistakably not human in origin. They seemed to be responding to his recitations, or perhaps guiding them. The sound came from outside the station, from the forest itself. Conrad's hands trembled as he removed the headphones. The copper taste in his mouth had grown stronger. He needed to report this. Protocol demanded that any unusual activity be communicated immediately to the main office. Conrad reached for the radio, but his hand hesitated over the transmitter. What would he say? That he'd lost 8 hours. The trees were moving in impossible synchronization. That voices from the forest had somehow compelled him to perform calculations he didn't remember. It sounded like a psychological break, not a scientific observation. Yet the evidence surrounded him, recorded on instruments that didn't hallucinate. The pulses stopped at 3:21 in the morning, as suddenly as they'd begun. Every instrument flatlined back to normal baseline readings. The vibration in Conrad's chest faded. Through the window, the forest stood still and ordinary once more. But the silence persisted, that unnatural absence of any living sound. Conrad sat at his desk, staring at the notes he didn't remember writing, and forced himself to think logically. He was a scientist. There had to be an explanation. Dawn came slowly, gray light filtering through the windows. Conrad had spent the remaining hours of his shift documenting everything, making copies of the strange notes, securing the data tapes, recording his observations with as much detachment as he could manage. When the morning shift operator arrived, Conrad gave a brief report about instrument anomalies and recommended a full systems check. He didn't mention the lost time or the voices on the tape. Not yet. The drive home became another gap in his memory. Conrad found himself pulling into his driveway with no clear recollection of the route he'd taken. The 40-minute drive should have been automatic, a path he'd traveled hundreds of times, but it was simply gone from his mind. He sat in his car, engine off, and looked down at his hands. Dirt caked under his fingernails, dark soil that hadn't been there when he'd left the station. He'd washed his hands before leaving. He distinctly remembered washing them. Pine needles were scattered across the passenger seat and floor of his car. Fresh green needles, not the brown dead ones that littered the ground around the monitoring station. Conrad reached down and picked one up, rolling it between his fingers. It was soft, alive, and it had no business being in his vehicle. The paved area around the station was swept clean. He hadn't walked through any living forest during his shift. 2 days later, Conrad met with his supervisor at the main office. He brought the data tapes and his documentation, prepared to present his findings and request a formal investigation. His supervisor, a veteran of the Forest Service named Matthias, listened with an expression that shifted from professional interest to something harder to read. When Conrad finished, Matthias was quiet for a long moment. "You're the fourth," Matthias finally said. "Fourth seismologist to report irregular experiences at that station. The 3 before you all resigned. None of them would go into detail about what they encountered, just said they couldn't work there anymore." Matthias pulled a file from his desk drawer, thick with incident reports and personnel records. "We've had that station monitored for unusual activity since 1993. The instruments are functioning perfectly. The data they collect is valuable, but something happens to people who work the overnight shifts there. Something we can't explain and can't seem to prevent." Conrad felt a chill run through him that had nothing to do with the office temperature. Why didn't anyone warn me? "Would you have believed it? Would you have taken the position?" Matthias asked, and Conrad had no answer. "The station stays operational because we need the data. Mount St. Helens isn't finished. We need to know if it's waking up again, but I can't force anyone to work there if they're not comfortable. If you want to transfer, I'll approve it immediately. No questions, no mark on your record." Conrad looked at the file on the desk, at the data tapes he'd brought as evidence, at his own hands, still showing traces of dirt under the nails no matter how many times he'd scrubbed them. He thought about those 8 missing hours, about mathematical formulas appearing in his handwriting, about voices speaking in unison from a forest that should have been empty. Part of him wanted to walk away, to take the transfer and never think about that station again. But another part, the part that had dedicated his life to understanding the world through observable phenomena, needed answers. "I'll stay," Conrad heard himself say, "but I want full access to the previous reports. Everything the others documented before they left." Matthias nodded slowly, something like respect or perhaps pity crossing his face. "I'll get you the files. But Conrad, be careful. Whatever is happening out there, it's beyond our current understanding, and things beyond our understanding don't always let us walk away unchanged." Conrad returned to work, diving into the reports from the 3 seismologists who'd preceded him. Their experiences varied in details, but shared common elements that made his skin crawl. Lost time, impossible synchronizations, a sense of being observed by something vast and incomprehensible. One had written extensively about feeling like a participant in something rather than an observer, as if his consciousness had been borrowed for purposes he couldn't fathom. Another described the sensation of information being extracted from his mind, knowledge pulled out and examined by an intelligence that regarded human thought, the way a scientist might study bacteria under a microscope. The station continued its work. The instruments continued their vigilant watch over the restless mountain, and Conrad continued his shifts, armed now with knowledge of what had come before but no closer to understanding what it meant. The pulses returned irregularly, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes several nights in succession. Each time, Conrad documented everything with scientific precision, even as pieces of himself seemed to slip away into those rhythmic 7.3-second intervals. He never discovered what caused the phenomena. The investigation he'd hoped for never materialized. Official reports attributed the experiences to isolation-induced psychological stress, despite the physical evidence suggesting otherwise. Conrad worked at that station for 8 more months before finally accepting the transfer Matthias had offered. Not because he was afraid, but because he'd begun to recognize a pattern in his own behavior that terrified him more than any external mystery. He was starting to look forward to the pulses, starting to crave those moments when something vast and unknowable paid attention to the small monitoring station on the ridge, starting to feel disappointed on quiet nights when nothing unusual occurred. Whatever was out there in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, whatever had touched his mind and borrowed his hands to write formulas he didn't understand, it had changed something fundamental in how Conrad perceived reality. Years later, he would still taste copper on certain October nights, would still find himself performing complex calculations without conscious thought, his hands moving across paper while his mind drifted somewhere else entirely. The forest had marked him in ways that didn't show on any medical scan or psychological evaluation. And sometimes, in the moments between waking and sleep, Conrad could hear them again. Those voices speaking in perfect unison, calling from beneath the ground where ancient things waited, with patience beyond human comprehension, counting down to a moment when the response window would open once more. Zakir had been volunteering with search and rescue for 3 years when the call came in on that July morning in 2015. A 19-year-old female hiker was overdue from what should have been a simple day hike on the University Falls Trail in Tillamook State Forest. The report came from her roommate, who'd expected her back the previous evening. Standard protocol kicked in immediately. Zaire loaded her gear and met her K9 partner, a German Shepherd named Ajax, at the trailhead parking area off Highway 6 near milepost 28. The morning was already warm, promising a hot afternoon in the coastal range forest of Oregon. Ajax picked up the scent almost immediately near the trail marker. The dog was experienced, had located 7 missing persons in the past 2 years, and Zaire trusted his instincts completely. But something felt off from the start. Ajax kept looking back at her instead of focusing forward on the track. His usual confident gait was replaced by hesitant movements, and that low whine in his throat that Zaire had never heard from him before set her nerves on edge. She'd worked with Ajax long enough to read his body language, and right now every signal screamed that something was wrong. They moved along the main trail for about 15 minutes before Ajax alerted and pulled toward the west, off the established path. Zaire followed, marking their position on her GPS unit and radioing their deviation to the command post. The forest here was dense, second-growth Douglas fir and western hemlock, creating a canopy that filtered the sunlight into scattered patches on the forest floor. Sword ferns and salal formed thick understory that made movement slow and deliberate. 400 yards off trail, Zaire spotted the backpack. It was propped against a fallen log, positioned almost carefully rather than dropped or discarded. She called Ajax to heel and approached cautiously, her training kicking in to preserve the scene. The pack was a standard student hiking bag, teal and gray, with water bottles in the side pockets and multiple compartments. Zaire photographed it before touching anything, then carefully opened the main section. Inside, she found a phone, wallet with driver's license confirming the missing hiker's identity, 2 full water bottles, energy bars, and a light jacket. Everything a day hiker would bring and absolutely nothing she would intentionally leave behind. What made Zaire's stomach tighten was what she found around the backpack. Fresh boot prints circled the area, men's size by the look of them, probably size 11 based on the length. The tread pattern was distinct, a waffle design with a worn spot on the right heel. These prints weren't from someone passing by. They circled the backpack location multiple times, overlapping in places as if someone had been pacing while watching the pack, or waiting. Zaire moved in a wider circle, Ajax staying close to her side now, his hackles raised. 30 feet from the backpack, she found the blind. Someone had constructed it recently, broken branches woven together to create a concealed position with a clear sight line to both the backpack and a section of the main trail visible through the trees. The branches were still green, the brakes fresh enough that sap still leaked from the cuts. This wasn't some old hunting setup. This was new, deliberate, and positioned specifically to observe without being seen. She keyed her radio to report the discovery. Static crackled back at her. Zaire adjusted the frequency, tried again. More static, broken by what might have been words, but too distorted to understand. Radio communication in these forests could be unreliable, the terrain and dense vegetation interfering with signals. But her handheld unit had worked fine just minutes ago. She marked the location on her GPS, took more photos, and made the decision to continue searching. The missing hiker was still out here somewhere, and every hour decreased the chances of a positive outcome. That's when Zaire heard the branches snapping. Not the random sounds of forest animals moving through undergrowth, but rhythmic, deliberate sounds coming from her left, deeper into the forest. She turned slowly, her hand moving to the canister of bear spray on her belt. Ajax growled low, a sound she'd only heard him make once before when they'd encountered a cougar on a training exercise. Movement caught her eye, maybe 60 yards away through the trees. A figure in dark clothing, too far to make out details, but definitely human, definitely watching. The figure was pacing parallel to Zaire's position, matching her speed, staying in the denser cover. She could see enough to know it was a man, average height, wearing what looked like a dark jacket completely inappropriate for the July heat. Zaire's training warred with her instincts. Protocol said, wait for backup, don't engage alone, maintain safe distance. But somewhere in this forest was a 19-year-old girl who might be running out of time. She made a decision that would haunt her later, wondering if it was bravery or recklessness. Search and rescue, she shouted, her voice cutting through the forest. Show me your hands and identify yourself. Ajax barked sharply, adding his voice to the command. The figure stopped moving. For a long moment, everything went still. Then Zaire saw him turn and move away, not running but walking with purpose, disappearing into the thick vegetation. She pursued, keeping Ajax close, moving as quickly as the terrain allowed. The figure had vanished, but his trail was clear enough. Broken branches, disturbed ground, and those same distinctive boot prints. Zaire followed for maybe 200 yards before Ajax alerted again, this time pulling toward a different direction entirely. She trusted the dog and let him lead. What Ajax found made Zaire's blood run cold. Hidden under a fallen log, tucked into the hollow beneath the massive trunk, was a cache. A blue dry bag, the kind kayakers used to keep gear waterproof. Zaire pulled on her gloves and carefully extracted it. Inside she found zip ties, the heavy-duty kind used in construction, a roll of duct tape, a folding knife with a 4-inch blade, and 4 driver's licenses, all belonging to different women, none of them the current missing hiker. Zaire was reaching for her radio when she heard the scream. A woman's voice, raw with terror, coming from somewhere to the northwest. The sound cut through her like electricity. Every instinct she had as a rescuer ignited. She grabbed Ajax's lead and ran toward the sound, crashing through ferns and leaping over logs, protocol completely forgotten in the urgency of that scream. The ravine appeared suddenly, a drop of about 15 feet into a drainage creek. Zaire slid down the slope, loose soil giving way under her boots. At the bottom, partially hidden by overhanging vegetation, stood an old hunting shack. The structure was falling apart, moss-covered and leaning, looking like it might collapse at any moment. The door hung open. Inside, Zaire found her. The missing hiker was bound with the same type of zip ties from the cache, duct tape across her mouth, her eyes wide with fear and relief. She was alive, bruised, terrified, but alive. Zaire pulled her knife and cut through the restraints, pulling the tape as gently as possible while scanning the dim interior of the shack. "He's gone," the girl gasped. "He ran when he heard you calling. He's been listening to the search and rescue radio. That's how he knew you were coming." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Someone had been monitoring SAR frequencies, using the information to find vulnerable targets in remote areas. When search operations began, he knew exactly where responders would be and could stay ahead of them, or, in this case, flee before being caught. Zaire got the victim outside, checked her for injuries, and managed to get her radio working long enough to call in their position and request immediate law enforcement and medical response. She kept Ajax between them and the forest, watching for any sign of the man's return, her hand never leaving the bear spray. The response came quickly once her signal got through. Sheriff's deputies, more SAR personnel, and paramedics converged on the location. The victim was transported to the hospital. The shack and the cache became a crime scene. Zaire gave her statement multiple times, describing everything she'd seen: the boot prints, the blind, the figure in the forest, the monitoring equipment they later found hidden near the shack, a police scanner programmed to SAR frequencies. Law enforcement moved fast. The boot print matched a brand sold at a local outdoor store. Security footage from that store, combined with the description Zaire provided, led them to a suspect within 18 hours. A transient with an outstanding warrant from Washington, known to frequent the coastal forests, living out of his vehicle and moving between campgrounds and trailheads. They found him at a rest stop on Highway 26, still wearing the same boots. In his vehicle, they discovered more zip ties, more duct tape, and a notebook with dates and locations. Dates that matched 3 other attacks on solo female hikers in the Cascade Range over the previous 18 months. Attacks that had been reported but never connected because they occurred in different jurisdictions across multiple counties. The missing hiker survived. Her physical injuries healed. The psychological scars would take longer, but she was alive because Zaire had trusted Ajax's instincts and made a split-second decision to pursue despite protocol. The suspect was charged with multiple counts of kidnapping, assault, and attempted murder. The evidence was overwhelming. The driver's licenses in the cache belonged to his previous victims, trophies he'd kept. But what stayed with Zaire, what woke her up at night for months afterward, was how close it had been. How many times she'd been in that forest, responding to calls, searching for lost hikers, never knowing that someone might be watching, never considering that the wilderness held human predators as dangerous as any animal. The forest had always felt like a place of natural challenges, weather and terrain, and the occasional wildlife encounter. Now it felt different, contaminated by the knowledge that someone had turned it into a hunting ground, had used the very systems designed to save lives as tools to identify and track victims. Ajax never quite recovered his confidence either. The dog still worked, still found missing persons, but that eager forward drive was gone. He'd learned the same lesson Zaire had, that not everyone in the forest was lost and needing help. Some were there with darker purposes, and the scent trails didn't tell you which was which until it was almost too late. The Tillamook State Forest returned to its normal routines. Hikers still walked the University Falls Trail. Search and rescue still responded to calls. But Zaire carried bear spray now, and a personal alarm, and she never went into the forest alone anymore. The trial happened 8 months later. The suspect was convicted on all counts. Zaire testified, describing that July day in careful detail. The missing hiker testified too, brave and clear-eyed, refusing to let fear win. In the end, justice was served. The predator was caged. But Zaire knew the truth that civilian hikers rarely considered. The forest wasn't empty. It wasn't just trees and animals and scenic views. People used it for all kinds of purposes, and not all of those purposes were innocent. Somewhere out there, maybe in Tillamook, maybe in another coastal forest, someone else might be listening to radio frequencies and watching trailheads and waiting for opportunity. The wilderness was beautiful and dangerous in ways most people never imagined. And the most dangerous thing in it walked on two legs and knew exactly how to use isolation as a weapon. Have you ever felt like you were being watched while hiking alone? Quinn had been working as a timber faller for 22 years when his crew was assigned to a commercial harvest operation in the Seismologist National Forest near Mapleton, Oregon. It was March 2003, and the logging company had secured the permits for a designated harvest area that promised good yields. Quinn knew these forests well, had worked sections of the Seismologist for over a decade, and considered himself an expert at reading timber and terrain. He took pride in his precision, in the mathematical certainty of notch angles and hinge cuts that could drop a 100-foot Douglas fir within inches of where he intended. In 22 years, he'd never misjudged a fall badly enough to cause real problems. The crew arrived at the site on a gray Monday morning, 6 men total, including Quinn. The area had been surveyed and marked by Forest Service personnel, stakes with orange flags indicating which trees were designated for harvest. Standard procedure. But as Quinn walked the site that first morning, something felt wrong. In the center of the harvest area stood a grove of ancient Douglas firs, trees that had to be 400 years old or more based on their diameter and the character of their bark. These were old growth giants, the kind that should have been protected, not marked for cutting. Quinn approached the crew supervisor, a man named Mac, who'd been running operations for the company for 15 years. "Those trees in the center section," Quinn said, pointing to the grove. "They're not supposed to be in a designated cut area. Forest Service doesn't mark old growth like that for harvest anymore." Mac pulled out the survey maps and GPS coordinates, double-checking the information. "Coordinates match," he said. "This is the section we're permitted for. Everything inside these boundaries is authorized." He looked at Quinn with the expression of a man under pressure to meet quotas. "We're already behind schedule from that weather delay last month. We need to make up time." Quinn didn't like it, but the paperwork seemed clear. Maybe there had been a mistake in the original survey, some administrative error that included trees that should have been excluded. It wouldn't be the first time bureaucracy had created problems. He made a mental note to follow up with the Forest Service office later, but for now, they had a job to do. They started with the perimeter trees, working their way inward. Quinn made his cuts with his usual precision, calculating angles, checking wind, ensuring safe fall directions. The first tree he dropped was a second-growth fir about 80 years old. Not particularly large, but good timber. He made his undercut, set his back cut, and tapped in the wedge. The tree began its fall exactly as planned, leaning into the path Quinn had calculated. Then it didn't. Midway through the fall, the tree twisted, an impossible motion that defied physics and everything Quinn knew about timber falling. It crashed through 3 other marked trees, destroying understory vegetation in an expanding pattern of devastation. The sound echoed wrong through the forest, not the clean crack and whoosh of a proper fall, but something that seemed to reverberate and multiply. And then silence. Complete and absolute silence. No birds, no wind, no sound of chainsaws from the other crew members working nearby. Even the echo of the chainsaw Quinn had just been running seemed muffled, as if the forest itself was absorbing sound. Quinn checked his saw, checked the stump, examined every aspect of the cut. Perfect notch, perfect hinge, perfect angle. The tree should not have fallen the way it did. Mac came over, concern evident on his face. They examined the fallen tree together, looking for rot or structural weakness that might explain the anomaly. The wood was solid, healthy, no signs of internal decay. Freak accident, Mac finally said, though his voice lacked conviction. Let's be more careful with the next ones. The crew continued working, but the atmosphere had changed. Everyone felt it. That unnatural quiet, the way sound seemed to die too quickly in the air. Around midday, one of the crew members, a younger guy who'd been working on the western edge of the site, came stumbling out of the trees. His name was Rowan, and he'd been healthy that morning, joking with the others during the drive to the site. Now his arms and neck were covered in an angry red rash, welts rising on his skin where bark dust had contacted exposed areas. He was gasping, struggling to breathe, his chest heaving with the effort. The crew medic, who'd seen everything from chainsaw injuries to bee sting allergies, took one look at Rowan and called for emergency evacuation. His lungs sound full of fluid, he told Mac. Like pneumonia, but it came on in hours, not days. I've never seen a reaction this severe this fast. A helicopter evacuation was arranged, lifting Rowan out of the forest to the nearest hospital. The rest of the crew stood watching, unsettled. Bark dust was a known irritant, could cause respiratory issues over long-term exposure, but not like this. Not instant and severe enough to require emergency medical intervention. That night at the logging camp, Quinn couldn't sleep. None of them could. Every man in the crew experienced the same nightmare, identical in every detail. They were walking through the forest, surrounded by trees, and the trees were screaming. Not making sound, but screaming through their roots, through the ground itself, a vibration of agony and rage that Quinn could feel in his bones. He woke standing outside his tent in bare feet, disoriented and cold, surrounded by the stumps they'd created that day. The pre-dawn light made the cut wood look like wounds, pale and exposed. The crew returned to the site after sunrise, reluctant but obligated. The equipment wouldn't start. Fresh fuel in the tanks, new batteries installed the previous week, everything maintained to specification. Nothing would turn over. The hydraulic lines on the feller buncher, the mechanical harvester they used for smaller trees, had ruptured overnight. All of them, simultaneously, spraying hydraulic fluid across the machine and the ground. There was no vandalism evidence, no sign that anyone had tampered with the equipment. The machine had been locked, the site secured. Then Quinn saw the stumps. Every tree they'd cut the previous day was covered in fungal growth. Massive blooms of mushrooms in shades of gray and sickly white, caps the size of dinner plates, covering the cut surfaces completely. The growth was so extensive, it looked like months of decay compressed into a single night. And the smell, rot, and decomposition mixed with ammonia, so strong it made Quinn's eyes water. Visible spores hung in the air like dust, releasing from the fungal masses in clouds whenever anyone moved nearby. Mac called the Forest Service immediately. Within hours, environmental specialists arrived in hazmat suits, taking samples, testing air quality, establishing a quarantine perimeter. The crew was ordered to evacuate the site and report for medical screening. Quinn learned later that the fungal species was unknown, didn't match anything in the existing databases. The growth showed aggressive lignin decomposition properties, breaking down wood fiber at rates that shouldn't be possible. But the environmental team found something else during their survey of the area. Evidence of an indigenous burial ground, never recorded in any Forest Service documentation, never included in any survey or environmental impact assessment. The old growth grove Quinn had questioned wasn't just ancient trees. It was a sacred site, and the logging company had clear-cut right through it. Federal investigations followed. The permits were suspended. The logging company faced violations and fines, but for Quinn and the other crew members, the damage was already done. 6 months after the incident, Quinn developed a chronic cough that wouldn't respond to antibiotics. Doctors found microscopic fungal colonization in his lung tissue, a species they couldn't identify and couldn't eliminate. 4 other crew members from that site developed similar respiratory conditions. They weren't dying, but they weren't healthy either, and the medical professionals treating them had no protocols for whatever was growing in their lungs. The harvest area itself became a study in ecological horror. Despite replanting efforts, despite every standard reforestation technique, nothing would grow in the clear-cut. Seedlings died within weeks of planting. The fungal bloom didn't fade, but spread, consuming the surrounding forest at a measured rate of 15 feet per year. Satellite imagery tracked its progress. A growing dead zone that expanded with geometric precision from the center point, where the old growth grove had stood. Quinn stopped working in the forest after his diagnosis. He couldn't handle the physical demands anymore, and honestly, he didn't want to. Every time he looked at trees now, he remembered that nightmare, the sensation of them screaming through their roots. He remembered the wrongness of that first tree falling in a direction physics said was impossible. He remembered standing barefoot among the stumps and feeling like he'd participated in a violation that nature itself would never forgive. The guilt was the worst part. Quinn had known those old growth trees shouldn't have been marked for harvest. He'd questioned it, but he'd deferred to the paperwork, to the permits, to the authority of maps and coordinates. He'd let bureaucracy override his own knowledge and instincts. And now he carried the consequences in his lungs, in his dreams, in the knowledge that he'd been part of destroying something that had stood for 4 centuries and served purposes he'd never understood. Rowan, the crew member who'd been emergency evacuated that first day, never fully recovered. His respiratory system was permanently damaged, his career in forestry over at 26 years old. The other crew members scattered to different companies, different states, none of them wanting to talk about what happened in the Siuslaw that March. Mac quit the logging industry entirely, last Quinn heard, working construction in Idaho where he'd never have to see a standing forest again. The Siuslaw National Forest continued its cycles, protected areas thriving while other sections faced managed harvests according to Forest Service plans. But that one area, that expanding dead zone centered on what had been an indigenous burial ground, remained. Scientists studied it. Reports were written. Theories were proposed about unique fungal species and soil contamination and ecological cascade failures. None of the explanations quite captured what Quinn knew in his gut. They'd cut something that should have remained standing, had violated something sacred, and the forest was still responding to that violation, still spreading the consequences outward, like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Quinn thought about those trees often, especially the ones he'd dropped personally. He thought about the precision of his cuts, the pride he'd taken in his skill. He wondered if the trees had felt it, the bite of the chainsaw, the moment of falling. He wondered if that nightmare had been just a dream or something else, some kind of message transmitted through mycelial networks and root systems, the forest's collective memory of pain. Scientists talked about how trees communicated through fungal connections underground, sharing nutrients and information across vast distances. If that was true, then every tree in that forest knew what had happened. Every tree carried the memory of the violation, and Quinn carried his own memory, his own violation written in fungal tissue in his lungs, a permanent reminder that some places demanded respect, some things should never be cut, and nature's justice didn't arrive with fanfare or warning. It arrived slowly, methodically, spreading at 15 feet per year and showing no signs of stopping. Would you still take the job if the coordinates said it was approved? Layla was a content creator who'd built a modest following on YouTube, documenting her hiking adventures throughout the Pacific Northwest. In September 2021, she had about 17,000 subscribers who tuned in regularly to watch her solo hiking videos, drawn by her genuine enthusiasm for the outdoors and her practical advice for beginner hikers. She wasn't trying to be an influencer in the traditional sense, just sharing her love of the trails and the peace she found in the forests and mountains. That September day, she planned to hike the Ramona Falls Loop Trail in Mount Hood National Forest, a popular route known for its stunning waterfall and relatively easy terrain. Layla set out early, her GoPro Hero 9 mounted on a chest harness and her iPhone 12 ready for photos. The weather was perfect, clear skies and comfortable temperatures, the kind of day that made the Pacific Northwest feel like paradise. She filmed her standard introduction at the trailhead, talking to the camera about the route, the expected mileage, and what viewers could look forward to seeing. Other hikers were already on the trail, passing her as she filmed, offering friendly waves and good mornings. Everything felt normal and routine. The hike itself was beautiful. Layla stopped frequently to capture footage of the old-growth forest, the way morning light filtered through the canopy, the sound of the creek running parallel to the trail. She took selfie videos at various mile markers, did her usual talking head segments about the trail conditions and points of interest. At the falls, she spent extra time getting different angles, the cascading water creating natural white noise that her microphone picked up perfectly. She felt good, energized by the exercise and the beauty surrounding her. By early afternoon, she was back at the trailhead parking lot, tired but satisfied with the footage she'd captured. Layla's routine was to review the day's footage before the drive home, doing a quick check to make sure everything had recorded properly and to get a sense of how much editing she'd need to do. She pulled out her laptop, connected her GoPro, and started playing through the videos. The first few clips looked great, exactly what she'd expected. Then she reached the footage from mile marker 2.3, a section where she'd stopped to film a talking head segment about the forest ecology. In the background of the video, maybe 50 feet behind where Layla stood, there was a figure. A person standing completely motionless among the trees, facing the camera. Layla paused the video and stared at the screen. She had been alone at that spot. She remembered it clearly because she'd waited for a group of hikers to pass before starting to film, specifically wanting the trail empty for a cleaner shot. Yet there in the footage, clear as day, was someone standing in the background. The figure appeared in 47 seconds of continuous video, never moving, never shifting position, just standing there, facing the camera directly. Layla felt a chill run down her spine despite the warm afternoon. She zoomed in using her video editing software, trying to get a better look at who or what she'd captured. As she increased the magnification, the image began to distort. Digital artifacts appeared, the kind of tearing and pixelation that happened with corrupted files. The audio track simultaneously degraded into pure static, a harsh white noise that made her pull her headphones off. Layla stopped the playback and sat back, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Maybe it was just another hiker she hadn't noticed, though that didn't explain the distortion when she tried to zoom in. She opened her iPhone photos, the still images she'd taken at the same location. She'd shot several photos at mile marker 2.3, standard landscape shots she used to break up the video content. She checked the timestamps. According to the metadata, the iPhone photos were taken at 9:42 in the morning. The GoPro video showed a timestamp of 12:37 in the afternoon. But that was impossible. Layla remembered taking the photos and shooting the video at the same time, setting up the shot, taking stills first, then switching to video. She'd done it 100 times on other hikes. The 3-hour discrepancy made no sense. Growing more unsettled, Layla went through all of the day's footage systematically. The figure appeared in 14 separate video segments, always at the same distance behind her, always motionless, always facing the camera, regardless of which direction Layla had been facing when she filmed. In a clip where she'd turned completely around to film the trail behind her, the figure had somehow repositioned to remain in the background, still facing the camera. The physics of that was impossible. No one could move that fast without being detected, and the figure never appeared to be in motion, just present in each shot as if it had always been there. The final clip she reviewed was the one she'd filmed at the parking lot, a quick sign-off video she always recorded before leaving. She'd been facing her car, talking about the successful hike and thanking viewers for watching. In the background, visible through her car's rear window, the figure was sitting in the driver's seat. Layla felt her hand start shaking. The figure was wearing clothing identical to what she'd worn on the hike. Same jacket, same backpack visible on the seat, same hair color and length. It was like looking at herself, but wrong somehow. The proportions slightly off, the posture too rigid. Layla's first instinct was to share the footage, to ask her subscribers if they could see what she was seeing, if they had any explanation for the impossible figure that appeared throughout her video. She uploaded the footage to YouTube, wrote a description explaining the strange occurrence, and titled it, asking for help understanding what she'd captured. The video went live at 6:30 that evening. At 8:45, she received an email notification that her video had been removed for violating community guidelines. Layla logged into her YouTube account confused. She'd never had a video removed before, had always been careful to follow the platform's rules. The notification said the content violated policies regarding disturbing or graphic content, and that her account had received a copyright strike. A copyright strike from an unknown claimant. No name, no company, just listed as copyright holder, with no additional information. Layla tried to appeal, clicking through the forms, and writing explanations that this was original content she'd filmed herself. The appeal was denied within an hour, an impossibly fast response that suggested automated systems rather than human review. YouTube support would only repeat that prohibited imagery had been detected and that the decision was final. When Layla pressed for specifics about what imagery had triggered the removal, she received template responses that explained nothing. Frustrated and increasingly frightened, Layla decided to delete the original files from her devices. She wanted them gone, wanted to forget the whole disturbing experience. She deleted the video files from her GoPro's SD card, emptied the trash, ran a secure erase. She deleted the files from her laptop, again emptying trash and using software to overwrite the deleted data. But when she checked her storage, the files were still there. Not in her organized folders, but present in her system taking up space. She deleted them again. They reappeared. Layla checked the file properties. Her 6 hours of hiking footage had somehow become 47 hours of video data. Files she didn't remember creating with names that were strings of random characters. She tried to open one. The video player launched but showed only corrupted imagery, pixelated blocks of color that shifted and moved. Except for single frames, clear images that appeared for a fraction of a second before dissolving back into corruption. In each clear frame, the figure was visible, progressively closer to the camera position than in the previous file. The most recently created file showed the figure standing 1 foot behind where Layla had been standing, close enough that she should have felt its presence, should have sensed someone directly behind her. In that frame, she could see its face clearly for the first time. It had her face, not similar, not close, but identical. Her exact features staring back at her from the screen, but with an expression she'd never made, something vacant and predatory at the same time. Layla shut down her laptop and didn't turn it on for 3 days. She told herself it was malware, some kind of sophisticated computer virus that corrupted files and created fake data. But malware didn't explain the figure in her original footage, the footage she'd reviewed immediately after filming, before any files had been transferred to her laptop. Malware didn't explain the impossible timestamps, or the YouTube removal, or the uncanny feeling that had been growing since she'd first seen that motionless figure standing in the forest behind her. When she finally opened her laptop again, driven by the need to use it for work, she found her YouTube channel had been permanently suspended. All of her videos, 3 years of content, were gone. The reason given was repeated violations of community guidelines, though she'd only ever had that single video removed. Her appeals went unanswered. Her backup files stored on an external hard drive were corrupted. Every hiking video she'd ever made was degraded into unwatchable static, except for those same single-frame clear images appearing at random intervals. In each one, the figure with her face stood somewhere in the background, watching. Layla stopped hiking alone after that. She stopped creating content entirely, couldn't bring herself to film anything. The experience had poisoned something she loved, turned the peaceful solitude of the trails into a source of anxiety. She wondered constantly if it had always been there. If every solo hike she'd taken over the years had included this unseen companion, if she'd simply never looked closely enough at her footage before to notice it. The thought was unbearable. She kept the iPhone photos from that September day, the still images that showed no figure, no anomaly, just beautiful forest scenery. She looked at them sometimes, trying to reconcile them with the video footage that showed something impossible. The timestamps still didn't match. That 3-hour gap remained unexplained. Layla had no memory of those missing hours, no sense that time had passed differently than she remembered. But the data didn't lie, and the increasingly large collection of corrupted video files on her devices suggested that something had happened during her hike that she couldn't explain and couldn't escape. Mount Hood National Forest continued to welcome thousands of hikers every year. The Ramona Falls Loop remained one of the most popular trails, recommended for families and beginner hikers as a safe and scenic introduction to the area. Layla sometimes wondered if anyone else had experienced what she had, if other solo hikers had reviewed their footage and found unwanted companions in the background. But she never asked in the online hiking communities she used to frequent, never posted about her experience anywhere except that one removed YouTube video. The fear that sharing the story might somehow strengthen whatever connection she'd made with the figure kept her silent. The files continued to multiply on her devices. She'd given up trying to delete them. They always came back, and each new file showed the figure incrementally closer, as if whatever it was continued to approach even though the hike had ended months ago. Layla didn't open the new files anymore, couldn't handle seeing her own face staring back at her with those wrong, empty eyes. She just watched her storage space diminish and wondered what would happen when the figure in the files finally closed the remaining distance, when there were no more incremental steps to take, when it reached the position where the camera had been, where she had been standing. If something appeared in your videos that you never saw in person, would you keep filming? Adelaide had been teaching elementary school for over 20 years when she lost her daughter Juliet in a car accident. It was November 1994, 3 months after the funeral, and Adelaide was still drowning in grief that felt bottomless and permanent. Juliet had been 16, bright and creative, with a passion for birdwatching that she'd inherited from Adelaide. They'd spent countless weekends together in the forests around their home near Forks, Washington, binoculars in hand, identifying species and recording sightings in matching field journals. After Juliet died, Adelaide couldn't bring herself to open those journals, couldn't face the careful handwriting and detailed sketches that represented a future that would never happen. But on a gray November morning, Adelaide found herself driving to the Olympic National Forest with Juliet's field journal in her backpack. She told herself she needed solitude, needed to be somewhere that held good memories instead of the crushing weight of her empty house. The Solduke Valley had always been one of their favorite locations, a place where they'd seen varied thrushes and winter wrens, where Juliet had once spotted a barred owl perched so close they could see individual feathers. Adelaide parked at the trailhead and walked into the forest with no particular destination in mind, just following paths they'd walked together. The forest was quiet in the way November forests are, most birds having migrated south or gone silent for the winter. Fog hung in the valley, turning the massive old-growth trees into ghostly sentinels that appeared and disappeared as Adelaide walked. She'd been hiking for maybe an hour when she heard them. Crows. Not the usual scattered cawing, but concentrated sound coming from one location deeper in the forest. Adelaide followed the sound, her naturalist instincts overriding her grief for a moment, curious about what would draw so many corvids to one spot. She emerged into a clearing and stopped, her breath catching in her throat. At least 60 crows, maybe more, gathered in complete silence. They filled the branches of surrounding trees, perched on fallen logs, stood on the ground in a loose circle. Every single bird faced the same direction, toward the dense forest on the far side of the clearing. Adelaide had never seen anything like it. Crows were social and intelligent, yes, but this level of coordination was unusual, almost unnatural. She stood at the edge of the clearing, afraid to move and disturb whatever was happening. Then the crows began vocalizing in perfect unison. Not individual caws overlapping, but synchronized sound, a rhythmic pattern that rose and fell like speech in a language Adelaide couldn't understand. The hair on her arms stood up. She was a rational woman, a science teacher who believed in observable phenomena and logical explanations, but this felt like something else entirely. The crows' synchronized calls seemed deliberate, purposeful, almost ceremonial. Adelaide felt compelled to follow their gaze into the trees. She couldn't explain the compulsion, couldn't articulate why she started walking in the direction all those birds were facing. It was as if the synchronized calling had reached something deep in her brain, bypassing rational thought and pulling her forward. She walked maybe 200 yards, leaving the clearing behind, pushing through salal and ferns that grew thick between the massive trunks of the ancient cedars. On the ground, scattered among the roots and undergrowth, were objects. Small things, carefully arranged in spiral patterns. Acorns placed with geometric precision. Bottle caps, their colors creating a gradient from rust brown to silver. Buttons of various sizes forming concentric circles. And in the center of the largest spiral, something that made Adelaide's heart stop. A silver locket on a delicate chain, tarnished with age, but unmistakable. She'd given that locket to Juliet for her 13th birthday. Juliet had worn it constantly for months before declaring it too young for her teenage style. Adelaide had buried her daughter wearing that locket, had specifically chosen it because Juliet had loved it once, had slipped it around her daughter's neck herself before the casket closed. Adelaide's hands shook as she knelt beside the spiral. She didn't touch the locket, couldn't bring herself to pick it up, but she stared at it through tears that blurred her vision. This wasn't possible. The locket should be in the ground with Juliet, should be locked in darkness and silence. Yet, here it was, arranged deliberately among other small objects in a pattern that looked intentional, meaningful. The crows took flight as a single unit, the sound of 60 pairs of wings lifting simultaneously, like a rush of wind through the trees. They landed in the branches surrounding Adelaide, creating a circle of black feathered bodies, and resumed their synchronized vocalization. The sound vibrated in Adelaide's chest, seemed to resonate in her bones. She looked up at them, at their intelligent black eyes all focused on her, and felt a presence that defied her rational understanding of the world. Adelaide pulled Juliet's field journal from her backpack with trembling hands. She flipped through pages of her daughter's handwriting, entries about bird sightings and forest walks, until she found what she was looking for. 2 weeks before the accident, Juliet had written about a place in the Olympic forest, describing it as where the crows meet. She'd written about finding objects arranged in patterns, about feeling like the crows were trying to communicate something. Adelaide had read the entry before, had dismissed it as creative writing, Juliet's tendency toward magical thinking mixing with her naturalist observations. Now, standing in what had to be the same location Juliet had written about, Adelaide wasn't so sure. The synchronized calling stopped. In the sudden silence, Adelaide became aware of other sensations. The temperature had risen, impossible given the November cold, warm enough that she unzipped her jacket. The smell of lavender filled the air, sweet and distinct. Lavender. Juliet's shampoo had been lavender-scented. Adelaide had donated all of Juliet's toiletries to a women's shelter 2 weeks after the funeral, unable to bear the smell that reminded her so viscerally of her daughter. Yet here in the middle of the forest, miles from anywhere, the scent surrounded her. Adelaide experienced something then that she could never quite categorize. Memory or vision, hallucination or moment of clarity, she was never certain. But she saw Juliet standing in this exact spot, younger, maybe 14, scattering birdseed for the crows. She heard Juliet's voice, not remembering it but hearing it fresh and clear, saying, "They remember everything. They remember people who are kind and people who cause harm, and they keep the forest memory." The vision or memory or whatever it was felt more real than the ground under Adelaide's knees, more present than her own grief. When it faded, Adelaide was alone with the crows and the spiral of objects and the impossible locket that should have been buried with her daughter. She sat in that clearing for a long time, crying in a way she hadn't since the funeral. Not the silent tears of numbness, but deep wrenching sobs that emptied her out and left her feeling lighter somehow, less suffocated by the weight of loss. Eventually, Adelaide stood and walked back through the forest to her car. She didn't take the locket. Something told her it belonged here, that removing it would violate something she didn't fully understand but needed to respect. She drove home and called a friend who'd grown up near the Quiloute Reservation, asking if she knew anyone who might be willing to talk about local beliefs regarding crows. The friend connected her with an elder named Tripp, a gentle man in his 70s who listened to Adelaide's story without judgment. Tripp explained that in Quiloute tradition, crows were sometimes seen as psychopomps, guides for souls between worlds, keepers of memory and witnesses to what humans might miss. He told her that corvids, crows and ravens both, had memories that spanned generations, that they could recognize individual human faces and pass that information to their offspring. He suggested gently that Juliet might have visited this place seeking peace before the accident, that the crows might have recognized Adelaide's grief and offered what comfort they could in their own way. Or, he said with a slight smile, maybe it was exactly what it appeared to be, something beyond natural explanation, and not everything needed to be understood to be accepted. Adelaide returned to the clearing monthly for the next 3 years. The crows were always there, though they never again performed that synchronized vocalization. They watched her with what felt like recognition, occasionally bringing small offerings that appeared near where she sat. A shiny pebble, a piece of blue glass worn smooth by water, a single white feather, small things that she collected and kept in a box at home, tangible evidence that something existed beyond her grief. She learned that Juliet had indeed been feeding crows near their home for years. Neighbors confirmed seeing her scatter seed and peanuts, watching as the local corvid population grew to recognize her. Corvids were known to bring gifts to humans who fed them, documented behavior that scientists had studied extensively. They remembered human faces, held grudges against those who threatened them, and showed what looked remarkably like gratitude to those who showed kindness. Everything Adelaide experienced could be explained by this documented behavior. The crows recognized her as Juliet's mother, brought her gifts because they associated her with the girl who'd fed them, arranged objects because that's what corvids did with items they collected. But that didn't explain the locket. That didn't explain the lavender smell or the warmth in November cold or the vision of Juliet that felt more real than memory. Adelaide chose to believe that some mixture of both explanations was true, that the crows were intelligent creatures capable of complex behavior and recognition, and also that something of Juliet persisted in that forest clearing, held in the collective memory of birds who'd known her kindness and continued to honor it even after she was gone. The clearing became a place of ritual for Adelaide, a way to process grief that therapy and time alone couldn't fully address. She brought flowers on Juliet's birthday, arranged them among the spirals that the crows maintained. She read passages from Juliet's field journal aloud, sharing her daughter's observations with the forest. She talked to Juliet, to the crows, to whatever presence or memory or echo existed in that place, and found a measure of peace she hadn't thought possible in those first dark months after the accident. Years later, when Adelaide finally felt ready to let go of some of her grief, she returned to the clearing one final time. The crows gathered as always, watching with their intelligent eyes. Adelaide left Juliet's field journal there, placed carefully at the center of the largest spiral. She told Juliet she loved her, told the crows thank you, told the forest it could keep the memories she'd been holding so tightly they'd nearly crushed her. When she walked away, she didn't look back. The Olympic National Forest continued its cycles, seasons turning, life persisting in patterns older than human grief. But in one small clearing in the Sol Duc Valley, crows continued to gather, continued to maintain spirals of collected objects, continued to bring small gifts that appeared and disappeared according to rhythms only they understood. And sometimes, on November mornings, when fog turned the old-growth cedars into ghosts, the smell of lavender drifted through the trees where no lavender grew, and the crows called in voices that sounded almost like ceremony, almost like memory, almost like love that refused to be buried. When grief becomes unbearable, would you trust what the forest offers? Leandro had been working as a communications technician contractor for 8 years when he got the job installing cellular signal boosters on a remote Forest Service tower in Colville National Forest. It was January 2018, deep winter in northeast Washington near the Canadian border, and the isolation didn't bother him. He preferred solo jobs, the quiet focus of technical work without the complications of crew dynamics. The assignment was straightforward, a standard 6-hour installation working with Motorola mobile repeater equipment and directional antennas. He arrived at the site just after dawn, the forest blanketed in snow that muffled all sound. The tower stood 80 feet tall, a lattice of metal rising above the surrounding pines. Leandro unloaded his equipment and began the preliminary checks, testing his radio and cell phone to establish baseline readings before installation. Immediately, he noticed interference. His radio crackled with a rhythmic digital clicking pattern that appeared simultaneously across multiple frequencies. He adjusted the settings, thinking perhaps he was picking up signal bleed from nearby infrastructure, but the interference intensified. The clicking had structure, almost like data transmission, 3 short bursts followed by 3 longer ones, then 3 short again. Leandro recognized the pattern immediately. SOS in Morse code, except the timing was slightly wrong and the sequence was reversed. He climbed the tower, his tools and equipment secured in a harness, boots finding purchase on ice-slicked rungs. At height, the interference grew stronger. He could hear it through the sealed housing of his radio, a persistent pulse that seemed to vibrate through the metal structure itself. Leandro pulled out his spectrum analyzer, a device that let him visualize signal frequencies and identify sources of interference. What he saw made no sense. The signal was strongest at 27.185 megahertz, a citizen's band radio frequency, but it was also broadcasting simultaneously across VHF and UHF bands. That shouldn't be possible without a sophisticated transmission array, the kind of setup that required significant infrastructure and power. Leandro spent 20 minutes trying to isolate the source, using the directional capabilities of his analyzer to triangulate the signal origin. The strongest readings pointed north-northeast, deeper into the forest, where his maps showed no infrastructure, no roads, nothing but wilderness. He finished the installation, professional obligation overriding his curiosity, but the interference never stopped. Every frequency he tested picked up that same rhythmic pulse that reversed SOS, repeating endlessly. Against his better judgment, against every protocol that said stay on site and complete the job without deviation, Leandro packed a small kit and hiked toward the signal source. The snow was deep, slowing his progress, but the analyzer gave him clear directional guidance, 2.3 miles through dense forest, climbing over fallen trees and pushing through snow-laden branches until he found it. A small clearing, roughly circular, contained what looked like a Cold War-era installation. Rusted generators lay half-buried in snow. A collapsed Quonset hut, its corrugated metal walls caved in and covered in moss, sat at one edge of the clearing. Obsolete transmission equipment, the kind Leandro recognized from technical history courses, scattered around like industrial debris. But one piece of equipment was active. A military surplus radio transmitter, jury-rigged to run on solar panels and car batteries, hummed with power. The solar panels were clean, obviously maintained recently. The battery terminals showed fresh connections, no corrosion. Leandro approached cautiously, his technical curiosity warring with a growing sense of unease. The transmitter was broadcasting the signal he'd been tracking, but it was doing more than that. A laptop connected to the system via serial cable, its screen showing scrolling data. Leandro recognized the format. GPS coordinates paired with timestamps, updating in real time. He pulled out his phone and photographed the screen scrolling through the data. Coordinates throughout the Pacific Northwest forest, dozens of them, with timestamps ranging from 1987 to 2016. 3 sets of coordinates caught his attention immediately. He recognized them from news reports, cases that had made regional headlines, sites where missing hikers' remains had been eventually found, but the coordinates on this screen showed timestamps from months or years before the official discoveries. One set of coordinates pointed to a location where a missing hiker had been found in 2003, but the timestamp on this system read July 1999. Another matched a 2011 discovery with a timestamp of March 2008. Leandro's hands were shaking now, not from cold, but from the implications of what he was looking at. This wasn't just monitoring. This was prediction or documentation of events before they were publicly known. He checked his radio, tried to call his supervisor, but the interference was too strong. Only static, and that persistent reversed SOS filled the channel. The sound of a vehicle engine cut through the forest quiet. Leandro's heart rate spiked instantly. He was miles from any road, or so he thought. But now he heard the unmistakable sound of a truck or SUV approaching on what must be an old logging road, hidden by snow and overgrowth. Panic overrode rational thought. Leandro grabbed his phone, made sure his photos were saved, and ran. He didn't go back toward the tower, didn't follow his own tracks. He just ran, perpendicular to the approaching sound, crashing through snow and undergrowth, his only thought to get distance between himself and whoever was coming to service that impossible installation. He found a dense thicket of young pines and wedged himself into the center, controlling his breathing, watching through the screen of needles and branches. 2 people emerged into the clearing, both appearing to be in their late 50s or early 60s, wearing civilian clothing that looked too casual for the weather and the location. They moved with the ease of familiarity, checking the solar panels, replacing one of the batteries, adjusting something on the transmitter. Their conversation carried across the snow-muffled clearing. "Signal degradation in Cascade Sector again," one said, his voice matter-of-fact, like he was discussing routine maintenance. "We'll need to run a calibration check on the western array." "Network's holding better than expected for the age of the equipment," the other replied. "How many active nodes do we have now?" 17 confirmed operational. The Olympic Peninsula installation went offline last month. We'll need to decide if it's worth repairing or if we redistribute coverage. They spoke for maybe 10 minutes, technical discussion that meant nothing and everything to Leandro. They were maintaining a network, Multiple installations like this one spread throughout the forests, broadcasting coordinates and timestamps. The why remained unclear, but the scale of the operation was staggering. This wasn't amateur radio enthusiasts or some quirky hobby. This was organized, long-term, and intentional. The two individuals finished their maintenance and left, their vehicle sounds fading back into forest silence. Leandro waited another 30 minutes before moving, making sure they were truly gone. He made his way back to the tower by a different route, avoiding the installation entirely. His truck was untouched. He loaded his equipment with shaking hands and drove back to cellular coverage, his mind racing. What he'd found demanded reporting, but to whom? Local police seemed inadequate for something this complex. Forest Service might have jurisdiction, but he didn't know who to trust. Leandro settled on the FBI, figuring federal law enforcement had resources for this kind of investigation. He called the Seattle field office from a gas station in Colville, explained what he'd found, and sent the photos from his phone. The response came faster than he expected. An agent named Lawrence called him back within 3 hours, asked detailed questions, and arranged to meet the following day. Lawrence was in his 40s, professional, but not dismissive, and he listened to Leandro's story with an expression that suggested this wasn't entirely new information. "We've been aware of unauthorized monitoring networks in Pacific Northwest forests for several years," Lawrence explained. "The challenge is attribution. Whoever is running this operation stays ahead of our surveillance. Every time we locate an installation and plan to stake it out, they seem to know. Equipment gets moved or powered down. The sites go dark." "But the coordinates," Leandro said, "those match real cases. People who actually went missing and were found later." Lawrence nodded slowly. 23 of the coordinate sets match confirmed missing persons cases. 11 others point to locations we haven't investigated yet because we had no reason to. That's what makes this so complicated. Are the operators trying to help locate missing persons? Are they documenting disappearances they witness? Or are they involved in causing them? We don't know. The ambiguity was worse than any clear answer would have been. Leandro thought about those maintenance workers, their casual discussion of network coverage and equipment calibration, operating in the winter wilderness like they owned it. He thought about the coordinates that predated official discoveries, information that could have saved lives if shared, or condemned them if withheld. "There's another layer that concerns us," Lawrence continued. "Some of the coordinate sets are future dated. Not predictions of where bodies will be found, but coordinates paired with timestamps that haven't occurred yet. The most recent one we're tracking is dated for March 2019. We don't know if these are predictions, planned events, or something else entirely." Leandro felt sick. March 2019 was 2 months away. Somewhere in the Pacific Northwest forest, a location was tagged with a future date, and no one knew if it was a warning, a threat, or something else entirely. He gave Lawrence all the information he could remember: GPS coordinates for the Colville installation, descriptions of the two individuals he'd seen, technical details about the equipment setup. The investigation that followed was classified beyond Leandro's clearance to know details. Lawrence stayed in contact for a few months, providing limited updates. The Colville installation was gone when agents arrived to document it, cleared out completely with no evidence it had ever existed beyond Leandro's photos. 2 other installations were located and monitored, but no one ever came to service them. The network appeared to go dormant, or perhaps just shifted to frequencies and locations the FBI hadn't identified yet. Leandro never went back to that tower. He requested reassignment to different territories, stayed out of Colville National Forest entirely. But the questions haunted him. Who had the resources to maintain a network of hidden installations across hundreds of miles of wilderness? What was the purpose of broadcasting coordinates before bodies were discovered? And most disturbing, what happened at the locations with future timestamps? March 2019 came and passed. Leandro watched news reports obsessively, looking for stories of missing hikers or unexplained incidents in Pacific Northwest forests. Nothing obvious appeared, or perhaps it did, and he simply couldn't connect the dots without knowing which coordinates the system had predicted. Lawrence stopped returning his calls. The case either went cold or continued at levels where civilian contractors weren't included. Years later, Leandro still thought about that winter day, about the choice to follow the signal instead of completing his job and leaving. He thought about the two men maintaining equipment in a hidden clearing, their casual competence suggesting this was routine for them. He thought about the network, still out there potentially, still broadcasting coordinates and timestamps, still marking locations in the wilderness where something had happened, or would happen, or was happening in ways he couldn't understand. The forests kept their secrets. The network kept broadcasting, visible only to those who knew which frequencies to monitor. And Leandro kept working as a technician, installing equipment on remote towers, always wondering if the next interference pattern might be another piece of a puzzle too large and disturbing for any one person to fully comprehend. Would you investigate a signal that could predict where people disappear, even if you might not like the answer? Milani was a mycology graduate student at Oregon State University when she began her dissertation research on mycorrhizal networks in August 2012. Her focus was the underground fungal connections between trees, the symbiotic relationships that allowed forests to share nutrients and information across vast distances. She'd secured permission to conduct a 10-day solo study period in a backcountry area of Crater Lake National Park near Lightning Spring, a location known for its diverse fungal populations and minimal human disturbance. At 26, Milani was ambitious and dedicated, perhaps too willing to push herself beyond reasonable limits in pursuit of academic achievement. She established her campsite on a Monday morning, setting up her tent and organizing her research equipment with the methodical precision she'd learned during her undergraduate fieldwork. Her tools included sterile sample containers, soil core extractors, tracer isotopes for mapping fungal networks, and extensive documentation supplies. The area was beautiful in the way remote wilderness always is, silent except for wind through the pines and the occasional bird call. Milani felt the familiar excitement of beginning new research, the anticipation of discovering something that might contribute meaningfully to scientific understanding of forest ecology. On day 4, she found it. A massive fungal fruiting body growing from a decomposing nurse log in a dense section of forest about half a mile from her campsite. The fruiting body was unlike anything in her field guides or academic references. 3 feet in diameter, luminescent pale blue even in daylight, with a texture that seemed to shift when she looked at it directly. Milani photographed it from multiple angles, took detailed notes on its size and location, and carefully prepared to collect a sample using sterile technique. She wore nitrile gloves and a respirator mask, standard precautions when dealing with unknown fungal species. The gloves had a microscopic tear she didn't notice, invisible damage from catching on a branch earlier that morning. When she used her scalpel to cut a small section of the fruiting body for analysis, the fungus released a visible cloud of spores. The cloud expanded rapidly, much faster than normal spore dispersal, and despite her respirator, Milani inhaled a trace amount. She felt a faint tingling sensation in her fingertips through the gloves, dismissed it as imagination or the cold, and continued her collection process. The sample went into a sterile container, sealed and labeled. Milani returned to her campsite feeling satisfied with the discovery. That night, she experienced vivid dreams. In the dream, she was underground, moving through soil not as herself but as something else, spreading through darkness as a network of threads. She could sense trees above her, their roots like anchors, and she could feel the communication flowing through the mycelial connections, information passing between organisms, a conversation she was part of but couldn't fully understand. The dream felt more real than most, visceral and immediate in a way that left her disoriented when she woke. Morning brought troubling developments. Milani discovered blue-white fungal threads growing on her sample bags and equipment. She'd sterilized everything, followed protocols precisely, yet contamination had occurred overnight. Her head ached with persistent pressure behind her eyes, and she felt mild fever symptoms. When she examined her hands, the skin under her fingernails looked darker, almost bruised. She told herself it was dirt, exhaustion, the early stages of a cold. She had 6 more days of field season, limited time to collect the data she needed, and doctoral candidates didn't abandon research over minor discomfort. She returned to the site of the massive fruiting body. In one day, it had doubled in size, 6 feet in diameter now, and it was pulsing. Slight rhythmic movement visible on its surface, like a heartbeat translated into fungal flesh. The trees surrounding it showed rapid decline, their needles dropping in abnormal quantities, bark splitting along the trunks. Milani documented everything, her scientific training overriding the growing sense that something was fundamentally wrong. Her field notes from day 6 showed deterioration in her usual precise documentation style. Technical language mixed with descriptions that didn't belong in scientific observation. She wrote about understanding the conversation, about hearing what the forest knows through mycelium, phrases that read more like poetry than research notes. She documented experiencing memories that weren't hers, vivid flashes of hiking this area in a different decade, wearing different clothing, following trails that no longer existed, getting lost, dying from exposure. The memories came with sensory details too specific to be imagination. The taste of fear, the cold seeping into bones, the final moments of consciousness fading. Milani realized with growing horror that she was receiving information through the fungal network about a previous person who had died in this location. Someone whose body had been absorbed into the forest floor, whose remains had been broken down and integrated into the mycorrhizal system. The fungus was sharing that person's final experiences with her, and she couldn't make it stop. Day 7 brought physical changes she could no longer rationalize away. Blue-white mycelial threads were visible under her skin, following the pattern of her veins. She could feel them pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat, could sense them spreading deeper into her tissue. Milani was simultaneously terrified and fascinated, her scientific curiosity warring with survival instinct. She continued documenting, photographing the progression, recording her symptoms with clinical detachment even as her handwriting became increasingly erratic. She attempted to radio for extraction but found herself unable to complete the call. Her fingers moved over the radio controls, her mouth formed words, but she couldn't bring herself to request help. Something in her wanted to stay, felt compelled to remain and complete whatever process had begun. The rational part of her mind screamed warnings, but that voice was getting quieter, drowned out by something else, a pull toward the fungal network, a sense of belonging that felt older and deeper than her individual identity. Day 9 produced Milani's final coherent journal entry. She wrote about watching mycelium emerge from under her fingernails, the threads tasting the air with movements that seemed almost curious. She described an overwhelming sense of connection, of being part of something vast and ancient. The forest wasn't separate from her anymore. She could feel it. Every tree, every organism connected through the underground network. The isolation she'd felt as a human dissolved into something that felt like coming home. Her entry ended mid-sentence, the pen trailing off the page. When Milani didn't check in on day 12 as scheduled, rangers were dispatched to her campsite. They found her tent and equipment scattered, everything covered in aggressive fungal growth that shouldn't exist in such quantities. The blue-white mycelium coated her sleeping bag, her research notes, her containers. 200 yards from the campsite, in a dense thicket off any established trail, they found Milani. She was alive but unresponsive, curled on the ground near the base of the massive fruiting body that had grown to nearly 10 feet in diameter. Blue-white fungal threads grew visibly in her hair, under her skin, emerging from beneath her fingernails. Her eyes were open, but didn't track movement or respond to voices. Emergency medical evacuation by helicopter got her to a hospital within 2 hours. Doctors removed what fungal growth they could access, cutting away external threads, cleaning visible contamination. But blood work revealed microscopic fungal colonization throughout her system. MRI scans showed the network had integrated with her neural tissue, threading through her brain in patterns that looked almost intentional, almost like they were following specific pathways. The fungal species didn't match anything in medical or mycological databases. Its growth rate and integration capabilities exceeded anything documented in scientific literature. Milani remained in a long-term care facility, nonverbal and minimally responsive. She seemed to track movement sometimes, her eyes following nurses and visitors, but she didn't respond to her name or show recognition of family members. On rare occasions, during what staff called her clear days, she would whisper. Coordinates and names, strings of information that seemed random until someone thought to verify them. The coordinates pointed to locations throughout Oregon and Northern California. The names belonged to people reported missing in wilderness areas over the past 3 decades. Every piece of information Milani whispered checked out. Coordinates matched where remains had been found or where search efforts had focused. Names corresponded to missing persons cases, some solved, some still open. She was accessing information stored in the mycorrhizal network, the accumulated history of every organism that had died and been decomposed in these forests, their final moments and locations preserved in fungal memory. Environmental teams investigated the research site. The massive fruiting body continued to grow, reaching 15 feet in diameter before finally stabilizing. The clear-cut area where Milani had worked refused to support new growth. Seedlings planted as part of standard reforestation died within weeks. Satellite imagery tracked the dead zone expanding at a rate of approximately 15 feet per year, consuming surrounding forest, converting living trees into standing dead snags. The fungal species was eventually classified as unknown and potentially dangerous. The site was quarantined. Researchers studied samples under the highest biosafety protocols, trying to understand its growth mechanisms and integration capabilities. Some theorized it was a previously unknown species activated by climate change or environmental stress. Others suggested it might be an invasive species, something that had always been present, but remained dormant until conditions aligned for explosive growth. Milani's mother visited her every week, sitting beside her daughter's bed, holding her hand carefully to avoid the patches where fungal threads still emerged despite repeated treatments. The doctors said the integration was too extensive for removal, that excising all fungal tissue would mean removing too much of Milani herself. They'd achieved a kind of stasis, preventing further growth but unable to reverse what had already occurred. On good days, Milani's mother talked to her about childhood memories, about the girl who'd loved exploring the woods behind their house, who'd brought home mushrooms to identify and insects to study. She talked about Milani's academic achievements, her passion for understanding forest ecology, her dreams of contributing to scientific knowledge. She didn't mention the irony that Milani had achieved that goal in the worst possible way, had become the subject of study rather than the researcher, her case written up in medical journals and mycology papers as a cautionary tale about unknown species and field safety. The whispered coordinates continued, irregular but persistent. Each one led to a story, a person who'd entered the forest and never left, their final experiences preserved in the network and now accessible through Milani's compromised consciousness. She'd become a living bridge between human and fungal intelligence, translator for the forest's memory, vessel for information that had been locked in mycelial networks for decades. The forest near lightning. Spring continued its slow death. The expanding dead zone visible from aerial surveys, a growing scar on the landscape. Scientists studied it, environmentalists protested it, and the fungus spread regardless of human concern. The mycorrhizal network that should have supported forest health had become something else, something that consumed rather than sustained, and no one knew if it could be stopped or if it would simply continue until it exhausted available resources. Milani remained caught between worlds, neither fully human nor fully absorbed, existing in a state that medical science had no framework to address. Her dissertation research had sought to understand how forests communicated through fungal networks. She'd succeeded beyond any academic ambition, had learned the answer by becoming part of the network herself, and the cost of that knowledge was everything she'd been before. Could you resist if understanding meant losing yourself completely? Rocco was an ultralight backpacker and trail runner in his late 20s, who'd been planning his attempt at the Wonderland trail speed record for 6 months. The 93-mile loop circumnavigating Mount Rainier was a bucket list challenge for serious hikers, and Rocco wanted to complete it in under 4 days, faster than his personal best. June 2023 offered optimal conditions, minimal snowpack, and clear weather forecasts. He started at dawn on day 3 of his attempt, ahead of schedule, feeling strong. The section between Mystic Lake and Carbon River was familiar territory, a stretch he'd trained on multiple times. Around midday, Rocco noticed something unusual about the trail ahead. It looked too perfect. Every rock was positioned optimally for foot placement. Fallen logs were angled as ideal step-ups. Even the vegetation seemed trimmed back to create perfect hiking width. In wilderness areas where trail maintenance was minimal and infrequent, this level of grooming shouldn't exist. Rocco had hiked this exact section 3 times during training runs, and it had been rough, technical terrain requiring careful navigation. Now it flowed like a manicured pathway. He slowed his pace, studying the trail surface, fresh footprints in the dust, boot prints that matched his own tread pattern exactly. The prints led forward on the trail, always 20 to 30 feet ahead of him. Rocco stopped completely, confusion overriding his focus on pace and mileage. He was the first person on this section today. He'd started before dawn, past no one, and this remote stretch rarely saw traffic, even during peak season. The prints couldn't be his own because they were ahead of him, leading the direction he was traveling. Rocco jogged forward, trying to catch up to whoever was leaving the identical prints. The footprints maintained their distance, always just ahead, visible around each bend and switchback. He could see disturbed gravel, bent grass stems, all the small signs of recent passage. But no person. Just the prints and the increasingly perfect trail surface. He noticed then that the trail seemed to be changing as he moved, grades smoothing out, rocks sinking flush with the ground, roots disappearing as if the path was optimizing itself in real time. He pulled out his GPS unit, checking his position. The coordinates showed him exactly where he should be on the Wonderland Trail, but something felt profoundly wrong. Rocco made a decision to turn back, to retrace his route and figure out what was happening. When he turned around, his stomach dropped. The trail behind him had changed completely. Dense overgrowth blocked the path. Fallen trees created impassable barriers, and all evidence of his passage was gone. No broken spider webs, no disturbed leaves, no footprints in the dust. The trail looked like no one had used it in months. Rocco checked his GPS again. His position marker showed him on the correct trail, but the physical reality didn't match the map. He tried moving back the way he'd come, pushing through the overgrowth, but the vegetation was too thick, the fallen trees too large to climb over. It was as if the forest had closed behind him, leaving only one option forward, following those impossible footprints. Fear started to replace confusion. Rocco had extensive wilderness experience, had navigated challenging terrain and weather, but this violated every natural law he understood. Trails didn't optimize themselves. Forests didn't rearrange to block retreat. His own footprints didn't appear ahead of where he'd walked. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to think rationally. He had supplies, water, navigation equipment. He could handle this. He continued forward, following the prints because no other option existed. The trail led him through sections that didn't match his memory or his map. Switchbacks appeared where the trail should run straight. Elevation changed in ways that didn't correspond to the topography, but his GPS continued to show him on the Wonderland Trail, moving at normal hiking speed toward the next waypoint. As afternoon faded toward evening, the trail led into an area his GPS didn't show. A small valley opened before him, completely enclosed by ridges, with a camping spot that looked impossibly perfect. Flat ground, a clear water source, natural windbreak, even stacked firewood arranged neatly near a fire ring. The footprints ended here, terminating at the tent site, as if whoever had been leading him had simply vanished at this destination. Rocco had no choice but to camp. Darkness was approaching, and attempting to navigate without knowing which direction was actually viable seemed foolish. He set up his ultralight tent, filtered water from the stream, and tried his GPS again. The unit showed him exactly where he should be on the trail, but the surrounding terrain didn't exist on any map. He attempted to call for help on his emergency beacon, but the device couldn't acquire satellite signal despite clear skies. The forest around the campsite was arranged in perfect symmetry. Trees stood at identical distances from each other. Ferns grew in concentric circles radiating from the center of the clearing. Everything looked natural individually, but unnatural in aggregate, too ordered, too precise. Rocco felt like he was inside a constructed space designed to appear wild while following geometric principles no natural forest would exhibit. Night fell, and Rocco stayed in his tent, not from exhaustion, but from fear. He heard footsteps circling the campsite, boot impacts that matched his own gait pattern exactly. The person or thing making the sounds walked the perimeter repeatedly, maintaining a consistent distance. Through the tent fabric, Rocco saw headlamp beams sweeping past, identical to his own gear. The light moved in patterns that suggested someone searching, scanning, looking for something. Rocco didn't leave the tent. He lay in his sleeping bag, listening to his own footsteps and watching his own headlamp beam through the nylon walls, and tried to understand what was happening. Some part of him was out there, or something that could perfectly mimic him, and it was searching. For what, he couldn't guess. He waited through the longest night of his life, every minute stretched by fear and confusion. Sunrise brought relief and new confusion. The footsteps had stopped. The forest was silent. Rocco emerged from his tent cautiously, scanning the campsite for any sign of his nighttime visitor. Nothing. He packed quickly, desperate to leave this impossible valley and return to familiar trail. The path resumed where it had ended the previous evening, leading upward toward the ridge. The trail was normal again, rough, technical, exactly as Rocco remembered from his training runs. His GPS showed him on the Wonderland Trail, and this time the terrain matched. He hiked for 3 hours, seeing familiar landmarks, passing day hikers, who waved and exchanged trail greetings. Everything was ordinary, routine, exactly as it should be. Rocco finished the Wonderland Trail circuit without further incident, completing his goal, though well past his target time. The strange detour had cost him hours he couldn't account for, time that seemed to have vanished from his tracking watch, despite his GPS log showing continuous movement. When he reached his car at the trailhead, relief flooded through him. He loaded his gear, changed clothes, and checked his devices. His tracking watch showed 8 hours missing from the log. 8 hours where distance was recorded, GPS coordinates were tracked, but no corresponding time data existed. He'd apparently traveled 15 miles at an impossible speed of 15 miles per hour through wilderness terrain. The GPS track showed him moving through an area that was marked on official maps as cliff face and impassable terrain, Weeks later, Rocco received a notification from the Washington Trails Association. His GPS upload to all trails had been flagged for review. The route he'd submitted showed him traveling through areas where no trail existed, maintaining speeds that were humanly impossible for the terrain difficulty, and passing through sections that were geologically impassable. The notification asked if he'd experienced GPS malfunction or equipment errors. Rocco didn't know how to answer. His equipment had worked perfectly, had recorded exactly what happened. But what happened violated natural laws and geographic reality. He'd followed his own footprints through a trail that optimized itself, camped in a valley that didn't exist, and lost 8 hours while traveling impossible distances. The data was accurate. The experience was impossible. Both things were true simultaneously. He never attempted the Wonderland Trail again. The experience had poisoned something he loved, turned trail running from meditation into anxiety. Every time he hiked now, he watched for signs of optimization, for trails that looked too perfect, for footprints that shouldn't exist. He checked behind him obsessively, making sure the path remained passable, that the forest wasn't closing options and forcing him forward. Other hikers reported similar experiences occasionally, stories shared in trail forums and dismissed as hallucination or altitude sickness. People who followed their own footprints, trails that changed behind them, campsites that appeared in impossible locations. The stories were rare enough to be individual anomalies, common enough to form a pattern if anyone bothered to connect them. Mount Rainier National Park continued to welcome hundreds of thousands of visitors annually. The Wonderland Trail remained one of the premier backpacking routes in the Pacific Northwest, challenging and beautiful and well documented. Ranger stations posted warnings about weather, wildlife, river crossings, all the normal hazards of wilderness travel. They didn't warn about trails that optimized themselves, or valleys that existed outside mapped reality, or the possibility of meeting yourself walking ahead on the path. Rocco kept his GPS data, the impossible track showing impossible speeds through impassable terrain. He showed it to a few trusted friends who offered explanations about satellite glitches and magnetic anomalies and equipment malfunction. None of the explanations felt right. The equipment had worked perfectly. It had recorded truth. The truth just happened to be impossible. He sometimes wondered about those 8 missing hours, where he'd been while his GPS said he was covering 15 miles through cliff faces. He wondered about the valley that had provided such perfect camping, whether it still existed in some pocket of space that overlapped with normal geography only when certain conditions aligned. He wondered if the figure circling his tent had been him, some version of himself trapped in a loop, searching for an exit he'd already found. The questions had no answers. The forest kept its secrets. Mount Rainier stood eternal and indifferent, its slopes hosting thousands of hikers who experienced only normal wilderness challenges. And somewhere in the network of trails that wound through old-growth forest and alpine meadows, pathways existed that didn't appear on maps, that led to places geography couldn't explain, that showed travelers their own footprints walking ahead into mystery. What would you do if the only way forward was following your own impossible tracks? Reuben had been working reforestation contracts in the Pacific Northwest for over 15 years when his crew was assigned to a burn zone in Wenatchee National Forest. It was September 1999, 5 years after the Tyee Creek fire had torn through thousands of acres near Leavenworth, Washington. The landscape still bore deep scars, blackened snags standing like monuments to destruction, ash layers visible beneath new grass growth. Reuben's job was to plant seedlings in assigned grid sections, part of the larger effort to restore the forest. He'd worked dozens of burn zones over his career and knew the particular sadness they carried, the silence where there should be bird calls, the stark contrast between destruction and the slow, patient work of renewal. On a Thursday morning in mid-September, Reuben was working alone in his designated grid section when he heard children's laughter. The sound echoed from deeper in the burn area, clear and bright, completely incongruous with the desolate landscape. The nearest access road was 4 miles away, and there were no homes within 15 miles of this location. Families didn't bring children to active reforestation sites, and the terrain was too rough and the scenery too grim for casual recreation. Yet the laughter continued, multiple children by the sound of it, playing somewhere beyond the ridge of standing dead trees. Reuben set down his planting tools and followed the sound. His curiosity was mixed with concern. If children were somehow out here, they needed to be guided back to safety. The burn zone had hazards, unstable snags that could fall without warning, ash pits that could hide twisted metal and broken glass from structures that had burned. He walked carefully, calling out as he approached, not wanting to startle anyone. He found them in a clearing, 6 children ranging in age from maybe 6 to 12 years old. They were playing with pieces of charred wood, arranging them in patterns on the ground, completely absorbed in their activity. What struck Reuben immediately was their clothing. The children wore outfits that looked decades old, styles from the 1950s, girls in simple dresses and boys in worn trousers and suspenders. The clothing was faded but intact, not the modern outdoor gear he'd expect on children in a remote forest location. The children looked up as Reuben approached, showing no fear or surprise at his presence. They smiled at him, friendly and open. One girl, maybe 8 years old with auburn hair and freckles across her nose, waved him over. The children appeared solid, real, casting shadows on the ash-covered ground. Reuben's rational mind struggled with what he was seeing, but they seemed like normal children, perhaps from a family homesteading nearby, though he knew no such families existed in this area. Reuben walked closer, keeping his voice gentle and non-threatening. He asked if they were lost, if they needed help finding their parents. The children looked at each other and giggled, as if he'd said something amusing. A boy who appeared to be the oldest, maybe 12, with dark hair and serious eyes, spoke up. He said they were here to help plant the new forest, that they'd been waiting for the trees to come back. The phrasing was odd, formal in a way children didn't usually speak, but Reuben attributed it to shyness or regional dialect. He asked where their parents were. The children pointed toward the denser section of the burn zone and said their parents were still looking for them over there. The auburn-haired girl added that they got lost when everything was burning. The casual way she said it, the matter-of-fact tone, sent a chill through Reuben's body. Before he could ask what she meant, his radio crackled to life. His supervisor's voice cut through with urgency, telling him to get out of the burn zone immediately. Fire weather warning had been issued. New ignition spotted. Evacuate now. Reuben looked at the children, feeling panic rise. There was a fire starting, and these kids needed to get to safety immediately. He told them they had to leave right now, that they needed to come with him to where it was safe. The children shook their heads. The auburn-haired girl said they couldn't leave until the trees grew back, that they'd promised to wait. Another child, a younger boy, said they had to stay and help the forest remember. Reuben could see smoke now, rising from beyond the ridge, gray columns that meant the new ignition was spreading. He reached for the nearest child, the auburn-haired girl, intending to physically carry her to safety if necessary. His hand passed through her arm like she was made of fog. He stumbled, shock and disbelief overwhelming his already strained understanding. The children smiled at him, sad, gentle smiles that seemed far too knowing for their apparent ages. They were fading, becoming translucent, and as smoke thickened in the air, they disappeared completely. Reuben ran. He grabbed his tools and sprinted toward the evacuation point, his mind refusing to process what had just happened. The fire spread quickly, spot ignitions jumping ahead of the main burn, and he barely made it to his truck before the flames cut off his escape route. Other crew members were evacuating too, everyone moving with the practiced urgency of people who'd worked around wildfire long enough to respect its speed and unpredictability. That evening, After the immediate danger passed and crews regrouped at the coordination center, Reuben asked questions. He spoke with local fire historians, people who'd worked these forests for decades and knew the area's history. What he learned made the experience even more unsettling. In 1952, before the area was designated National Forest, 3 families lived in a remote logging camp in the location where Reuben had been working. In August of that year, a wildfire swept through while the adults were at lower elevation getting supplies. 6 children had been left at the camp. All 6 perished in the fire. Their bodies were recovered, buried in a local cemetery, but the memorial marker had been lost to subsequent fires and logging operations. Reuben described the children he'd seen, their approximate ages, their clothing. The fire historian pulled out archived photographs from the 1952 incident. The images were black and white, grainy with age, but Reuben recognized them. The auburn-haired girl with freckles, the serious dark-haired boy, the others. These were the children who died 77 years ago, and he'd seen them playing in the burn zone as solid and real as any living child. The following year, when reforestation crews returned to the area after the new fire had been contained and evaluated, Reuben volunteered to work the same section. He needed to know if what he'd experienced was real or some kind of stress-induced hallucination. The grid section, where he'd encountered the children, showed extraordinary results. Seedlings had survival and growth rates of 99% versus the typical 60%. The trees were 3 times larger than surrounding plantings, healthy and vigorous. They grew in a spiral pattern, radiating from the exact clearing where the children had been playing. Reuben found small objects at the base of the fastest-growing trees, wooden blocks worn smooth by age and fire damage, marbles with their colors faded, a small doll with a porcelain face cracked but intact. The toys were placed deliberately, arranged as offerings or markers. He didn't remove them, felt instinctively that they belonged there, that disturbing them would be wrong. Other reforestation crews working that section reported hearing children's laughter during planting season. The sounds always came from the spiral growth area, always during the hours when Reuben had encountered them. The laughter was followed consistently by exceptional growth in newly planted trees. Word spread among the crews, not officially, but through the informal network of workers who spent their lives in these forests. The Tyee Creek burn zone became known as a place where something watched over the replanting efforts, where children who died in fire decades ago continued their promise to help the forest return. Reuben made it a ritual to work that section every planting season. He brought small offerings, cookies, and juice boxes, things children might have enjoyed. He left them at the base of the trees in the spiral pattern. By morning, the offerings were always gone. No evidence of animals disturbing them, no scattered wrappers or spilled liquid, just cleanly vanished, as if small hands had accepted and taken them. Years accumulated. The burn zone transformed from devastation to new forest. The trees in the spiral section grew fastest, towering over surrounding plantings, creating a grove that was visible from aerial surveys as a darker green circle in the landscape. Scientists studied the area, testing soil composition and examining root systems for explanations of the exceptional growth. They found nothing conclusive, just healthy trees growing in optimal conditions that happened to be arranged in a geometric pattern no natural process would create. Reuben eventually retired from reforestation work, his body worn by decades of physical labor. But he returned to the Tyee Creek area every September, hiking into the forest that was no longer a burn zone, but a thriving ecosystem. The spiral grove stood testament to something he'd witnessed and could never fully explain. He sat among those trees and sometimes heard the laughter, faint and distant, like echoes from across time. He left his offerings and spoke to children who might or might not hear him, thanking them for keeping their promise, for staying until the trees grew back. The Wenatchee National Forest continued its cycles: fire and regrowth, destruction and renewal. The land held memories in ways that transcended human documentation. Stories passed through worker networks, unofficial histories that spoke of places where the boundary between past and present grew thin, where those who died in these forests maintained connections to the land they'd loved or been taken by. Reuben believed because he'd experienced it directly, had reached out to touch a child and felt his hand pass through fog. He'd seen them fade into smoke, their smiles sad and knowing, their promise to wait for the forest extending beyond death and time. Whether they were ghosts, echoes, or something else entirely, they were present in those trees, in the exceptional growth that defied natural patterns, in the toys that appeared and disappeared, in the laughter that only some people heard. The spiral grove stood as their memorial, more lasting and meaningful than any cemetery marker. The trees grew tall and strong, rooted in ash and memory, watched over by children who'd refused to leave until they'd fulfilled their promise. And every autumn, when planting season came, those who knew the story brought their small offerings and listened for laughter, grateful for the guardians who turned tragedy into growth and loss into protection. Thank you for watching Bleak Fears. These stories remind us that the forests hold more than we can see, that some promises transcend death itself. If you've experienced something unexplainable in the wilderness, share your story in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more true horror from the darkest corners of the Pacific Northwest. Until next time, stay vigilant. If you heard children laughing where no children should be, would you stay or run?